It was a cool November morning, the kind that made the air feel clean and sharp. The town square was filled with people, families, veterans, students, and officials, all gathered for the annual Veterans Day ceremony. Flags waved gently. In the wind, and the smell of coffee drifted from a nearby stand. The stage was set up with chairs for guests and speakers, and a banner stretched across the front that read, "Honoring Those Who Served." Among the crowd walked an older man, his steps steady but a little slow. His name was James Walker, a retired Army sergeant who had served more than 20 years before hanging up his uniform. His short gray hair peeked out from under a neatly pressed cap, and his jacket carried a few ribbons and medals that spoke of years most people would never fully understand. James had woken up early that morning, shining his shoes, pressing his jacket, and polishing the small pins that once meant everything to him. He hadn't been to one of these ceremonies in years. For a long time, he didn't feel the need, but this year felt different. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been creeping in lately, or maybe he just wanted to stand again among people who understood what it meant to serve. Whatever the reason, he felt drawn to come. As he arrived, he smiled politely at the volunteers handing out small flags. The sound of a marching band warming up echoed down the street, and a crowd was forming near the stage. James adjusted his jacket and walked toward the seating area near the front, where he saw a sign that said, "Reserved for Veterans." He felt a quiet sense of pride. For once, he was right where he belonged, but before he could sit down, a young security guard stepped in front of him. The man was in his 20s, wearing a bright yellow vest and holding a clipboard. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his tone polite but firm. "This section is for participants only." James looked around confused. "I'm a veteran," he said simply, pointing to the medals on his jacket. "I served with the 103rd Infantry." The guard hesitated for a moment, then checked his list. "I'm sorry, sir," he replied. "Your name's not on the list. These seats are for those who were invited to speak or are part of the official ceremony." James nodded slowly, trying to keep his voice calm. "I understand. I'm not here to speak. I just thought veterans could sit here." "I'm afraid I can't let you stay in this section," the guard said, lowering his voice as people nearby began to notice the exchange. "You can stand with the public crowd over there." James looked toward the area the guard pointed to, a group of people standing behind a rope line, some holding flags, some chatting among themselves. He didn't want to make a scene. The last thing he wanted was to argue, especially not on a day meant for respect and remembrance, so he gave a quiet nod and said, "All right, son, I understand." He turned and began to walk away. It was a small moment, but it cut deep. He had spent years commanding soldiers, sleeping in desert tents and leading patrols through danger. Now he couldn't even sit in a chair at a ceremony meant to honor people like him. A few people nearby looked at him with sympathy, but no one said anything. He didn't blame them. Everyone just wanted the event to go smoothly. As he walked back toward the parking lot, the sounds of the ceremony grew louder. The announcer's voice over the microphone, the applause as names were called, the band playing patriotic tunes. But to James it all felt distant, almost hollow. His footsteps crunched softly on the gravel as he walked, his heart heavier with each step. He stopped near a tree and leaned against it for a moment. He wasn't angry, not really. He'd seen worse things in life, but he did feel forgotten, like the world had moved on without him. In the service, he had been someone people looked to for guidance. Out there, his voice mattered, his experience mattered. Now, he was just another old man in a jacket. He took off his cap and rubbed his forehead, remembering faces from long ago. The young soldiers who had served under him, some barely out of high school. He could still see them laughing around the campfire, could still hear the sound of their boots on gravel roads overseas. Some of those faces never made it home, and that was something he carried every day. As he stood there lost in thought, he heard a child's voice nearby. "Mom, why is that man leaving?" the little boy asked. James turned slightly, seeing a mother gently shushing her son. "He's probably just tired," she whispered, though her eyes followed James with quiet understanding. He smiled faintly and gave a small wave to the boy before continuing on. It was easier to smile than to explain. He reached his car, an old pickup that had seen better days, and rested his hand on the door handle. For a moment he thought about just driving home, turning on the radio and letting the day pass quietly. But part of him didn't want to go yet. He wanted to stay, to hear the speeches, to feel connected again, even if from a distance. He leaned against the truck and looked back toward the ceremony grounds. The crowd was large now, and the flags looked beautiful against the bright blue sky. He could hear someone on stage talking about bravery, sacrifice, and the importance of remembering those who served. James nodded softly. Those were good words, the kind of words he once said himself to younger soldiers. He thought of his old unit, the 103rd Infantry. He hadn't seen most of them in decades. They'd scattered across the country after deployment, each going back to their lives, their families, their own struggles. But they were never far from his mind. In some ways, they were closer to him than anyone else. Only they would truly understand how much a day like this could mean, and how it could also hurt. A gust of wind passed through the lot, carrying faint notes of the national anthem. James straightened his back out of habit, standing tall, hand over his heart. For that brief moment, everything else faded. The misunderstanding, the guard, the sting of being turned away. All that mattered was the flag waving in the distance and the memory of the men and women he once led. As the song ended, he let out a quiet breath and whispered, "That's what it's all about." He didn't know that in just a few minutes everything was about to change. The ceremony would take a turn that no one expected, and the man who had been told to leave would soon be the center of attention, not for his medals, not for his rank, but for something far deeper. For now, though, he just stood there, watching the ceremony from afar, a proud veteran on the edge of the crowd, waiting for a moment he didn't know was coming. James sat inside his old truck, the window half open, letting the cool air move through the cab. The ceremony was still going on in the distance, and though he could hear parts of it, he didn't really listen. His thoughts were somewhere else. Not in that parking lot, but years back, in places most people only see on the news. He closed his eyes for a moment and rested his hands on the steering wheel. The leather was worn smooth after years of use, just like his own hands. As the sound of the crowd faded behind him, memories started to play in his mind like old film reels, the hum of engines, the chatter of radios, the heat of the desert sun. He could still remember the first day he had stepped onto foreign soil as a young soldier. He wasn't afraid, not at first. He was focused, proud, ready to do his duty. Back then, he was strong, confident, and determined to keep his men safe. The faces of those men drifted back now, young, full of energy and jokes, always teasing one another to pass the time. They were more than soldiers. They were family. James remembered one night in particular years ago when his unit was stationed at a small outpost surrounded by nothing but sand and silence. The stars had looked close enough to touch. They had shared stories, laughed about things that didn't matter, and made promises they all hoped to keep. He smiled faintly at the thought. Those were the best and hardest years of his life. But the smile faded quickly. Not all those men came home. He could still recall the sound of helicopters, the shouting, the moments when decisions had to be made fast. Sometimes he wondered if he had done everything right, if he had missed something, if he could have changed the outcome. Those questions had followed him long after he returned home. He never spoke about it much. Not to his family, not to his neighbors, not even to other veterans. He carried it quietly, the way so many others did. But today, being told to leave, that ceremony, it opened something in him he thought had been sealed away. He had come hoping to feel proud again, to remember the good parts of serving. Instead, he felt invisible. He sighed deeply and looked out across the parking lot. A few cars were parked in neat rows. A family nearby was unpacking folding chairs, getting ready to join the crowd. A little girl waved a flag as her dad lifted her onto his shoulders. James watched them for a while, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That was what he had fought for families like that to live free and happy. Still, there was a quiet ache inside him. He thought about how life had changed after he retired. The first few months had felt strange. No early morning drills, no missions, no orders to follow. He thought he'd enjoy the peace, but instead, it felt empty. He tried working odd jobs for a while, but never stayed long. The rhythm of civilian life just didn't fit him. At home, his days were quiet. He'd wake up early out of habit, make coffee, and sometimes visit the town diner where a few other veterans gathered. They talked about the weather, sports, and the price of gas, never about the things that really weighed on their minds. It was easier that way. But recently it had been lonelier. His wife had passed a few years ago, and his son lived in another state with his family. They talked every now and then, but not often. Life had a way of moving on, even when people didn't mean for it to. Coming to this ceremony was supposed to be a small way to reconnect with the world, with the past, maybe even with himself. Instead, being turned away made him feel more distant than ever. He rubbed the edge of one of his medals between his fingers. It had a tiny scratch on it, a mark that reminded him of where it came from. It wasn't made to shine on a shelf, and it was earned in sweat and fear and loyalty. To him, every mark told a story. The sound of applause drifted across the lot, pulling him back to the present. Someone must have finished a speech. He imagined them talking about courage and sacrifice, and the words always sounded noble. But to those who lived it, courage wasn't about big moments. It was about getting up each day and doing your job, even when you were scared or tired. James leaned back in his seat and let out a soft laugh. "Guess they don't teach that part in speeches," he muttered to himself. He looked at the reflection of the sky on his windshield, blue and open, just like the desert sky he remembered. He thought about the men he had served with. Where were they now? Some he had lost touch with completely. Others had written letters once in a while, but over time those stopped too. Everyone had gone their own way. He wondered if any of them were here today. Maybe they were standing somewhere in that crowd, wearing their own old jackets and remembering their own battles. Maybe they were thinking the same thing, that the world remembered their service in words but not always in heart. For a moment, James thought about going back. Maybe he could just stand at the back of the crowd, watch quietly and listen. He didn't want attention or applause. He just wanted to belong, even for a few minutes. But then he pictured that guard's face and decided against it. He didn't want to cause trouble or look like he was trying to prove something. Instead, he turned on the truck's heater and sat quietly, hands resting in his lap. He thought about his old commander's words from years ago. A soldier's worth isn't measured by medals or speeches. It's measured by what he gives, even when no one's watching. That line had stuck with him. It reminded him that what he did mattered, even if no one said it out loud. As the minutes passed, the ceremony continued in the distance. The wind carried the faint hum of the crowd and the sharp notes of a bugle playing. The sound of it made his chest tighten. He knew that tune well. Taps. It was always played to honor the fallen. James stood quietly beside his truck, removed his cap and bowed his head. The air was cold, but he barely felt it. All he could feel was the weight of memory, of faces, voices, laughter, and loss. When the music faded, he lifted his head and looked toward the field. The flags waved gently and the people clapped again. He smiled softly. Maybe the world didn't always see men like him. Maybe they forgot sometimes. But he knew the truth. The ones who served carried the stories even if no one else did. And deep down he had a feeling that the day wasn't over yet. Something was coming. Something he didn't expect. He straightened his jacket, took a slow breath, and turned his gaze back toward the road leading to the ceremony. James stood by his truck, watching the flags in the distance move with the wind. The last notes of the bugle faded, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt deeper than sound. For a moment he thought that was the end of the ceremony, that everyone would soon head home. He was about to start his engine when something caught his ear, the sharp sound of commands being shouted. He turned and saw movement at the far end of the field. A group of uniformed soldiers was marching toward the stage. Their steps were in perfect rhythm, boots striking the ground with a strong, familiar sound. Even from where he stood, James could tell this wasn't just any group. Their posture, the way they carried themselves, it was the mark of a well-trained unit. The announcer's voice came through the speakers again, a little louder this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 103rd Infantry Battalion." James froze. The words echoed in his ears. The 103rd, his unit, his old family. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. For years he hadn't seen any of them. He didn't even know the unit still existed under the same name. His heart began to pound faster. He stepped away from his truck and looked closer. There they were, soldiers wearing the same emblem he had once worn proudly. And leading them was a familiar face, one he hadn't seen in decades. At the front marched a woman in uniform, her steps sharp and confident. She had been a young lieutenant back when James was a sergeant. Time had changed her. Streaks of gray touched her hair, and her face carried the calm strength of someone who had seen a lot. But her eyes still had the same spark. He remembered her clearly. She had served under him, always eager to learn, always the first to volunteer for the tough jobs. He had been proud of her back then, and now here she was, leading the very unit they had once shared. James felt a rush of emotions he couldn't name, pride, disbelief, and something that felt like coming home. He started walking back toward the ceremony without even thinking. He wasn't sure why, maybe just to get a closer look. People turned as he moved past them, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed fixed on the soldiers approaching the stage. The announcer continued speaking, introducing the group, sharing a few words about their history. James caught fragments of it, deployments, honors, recent missions. The crowd applauded warmly. Then, as the soldiers reached the center, the woman leading them turned her head slightly. Her eyes swept over the crowd, calm and focused. And then suddenly they stopped. She had seen him. James froze mid-step, his heart skipping. From where she stood, her expression changed. Surprise, recognition, and then something softer. She said something to the man beside her and stepped forward, leaving her line. The crowd watched, curious. The announcer fell silent. She walked straight toward James, her pace steady but quick. And when she was close enough, she called out, her voice strong and clear. "Sergeant Walker." "Sir, where are you going?" The sound of his old title, Sergeant, hit him like a wave. People around turned to look, whispering to one another. James felt his throat tighten. He hadn't been called that in years. He smiled awkwardly. "Didn't think anyone would remember me," he said softly. The woman stopped in front of him, her eyes bright. "We remember, sir. Every one of us." Behind her, the rest of the soldiers had turned to see what was happening. Some started smiling, others nodding. A few even saluted quietly. James felt warmth spread through him, melting away the cold he had carried all morning. He wasn't invisible anymore. The woman gestured toward the stage. "Come on, you're not leaving now. You belong with us," he hesitated. "I don't want to interrupt." "They said the seats were for—" She didn't let him finish. "Forget the seats. You're part of this unit's history. You built it." For a moment, James didn't know what to say. The crowd was watching, people murmuring softly, phones raised to capture the moment. The young security guard from earlier stood nearby, his face red with embarrassment. He looked like he wanted to disappear. The woman turned to the guard and spoke firmly but kindly. "This man led soldiers long before any of us put on this uniform. He's earned every place of honor there is." The guard nodded quickly, stammering an apology. "I didn't realize, ma'am." "I'm sorry, sir." James smiled gently and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It's all right. You were just doing your job." The crowd began to clap, at first softly, then louder, until the entire field was filled with applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was the kind that came from respect. The woman looked back at James and said, "Come on, Sergeant. Walk with us." He hesitated again, feeling both proud and humbled. Then he straightened his jacket and nodded. "All right, Captain. Lead the way." They walked side by side toward the stage, the rest of the unit falling in behind them. The applause grew even louder. Some people stood, waving flags, others wiping tears from their eyes. It was a moment that didn't need words. As they reached the front, the announcer stepped forward, looking a little stunned but smiling wide. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "we have an unexpected but very special guest, a man who once led this very unit, who served with honor and courage. Please welcome Sergeant James Walker." The crowd erupted again. James felt overwhelmed. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He stood there quietly, nodding, smiling, his chest tight with emotion. He looked out over the crowd, the faces, the flags, the sunlight glinting off medals. He glanced at the soldiers standing behind him, his old unit, now carrying the torch he had once held. He felt something deep inside settle into place. For years he had wondered if his service still mattered, if anyone remembered. And now, standing there surrounded by applause, he had his answer. The ceremony continued, but this time James wasn't standing off to the side. He was right where he belonged, with his brothers and sisters in arms, his heart full, the loneliness of the morning replaced by pride and connection. And as the national anthem began to play again, James stood tall, shoulders straight, hand over his heart. The woman beside him whispered quietly, "It's good to have you back, sir." He smiled without looking away from the flag. "It's good to be home. You said. The applause still echoed through the open space as James stood beside his old unit, trying to take it all in. It didn't feel real. Just an hour ago, he was standing in the parking lot thinking he didn't belong here. Now he was standing in front of hundreds of people, his old battalion behind him, the flag waving proudly in the breeze. The announcer stepped aside to give him space, and James felt the captain, the same woman who had called him back, place a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," she whispered. "Just stand with us." He nodded gratefully. Speaking wasn't his strength anymore. Silence often said more than words could. But the warmth he felt from the crowd was something he hadn't experienced in years. It was like being part of a family again. He could see faces in the audience, young soldiers watching him with admiration, older veterans nodding in quiet respect, and families clapping with genuine smiles. For a long time he had believed that the world had forgotten people like him, but now, seeing their faces, he realized that wasn't true. People hadn't forgotten. They just needed reminders of what service really meant. The captain took a step forward to speak into the microphone. Her voice was steady, but there was a clear emotion behind it. "This man standing beside me once led the 103rd Infantry with courage, strength, and a heart that never gave up. Many of us here learned what it means to lead by watching him, and today we are honored to have him standing with us again." The crowd clapped again, and James felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't someone who liked attention, but in that moment the recognition felt different. It wasn't about praise. It was about being seen, about being remembered. When the applause faded, the captain looked at him. "Would you like to say a few words, sir?" James shook his head at first, but then he glanced out at the people, at the soldiers standing proudly behind him, and something inside told him to speak, not a speech, not something rehearsed. Just a few honest words. He stepped toward the microphone. The crowd grew quiet. "I didn't plan to be here today," he began, his voice calm but strong. "Actually, I thought I wasn't supposed to be here." A few people in the crowd smiled softly, understanding. "I came because I wanted to feel part of something again." You spend years wearing a uniform, living with people who would give their lives for each other, and when that ends, well, it's not easy to adjust. He paused, glancing down for a moment before continuing. "But today reminded me that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It lives on, in every person who remembers, who respects, who says thank you. That means more than you know." He looked over his shoulder at the captain and the soldiers standing behind him. "And to my unit. Seeing you all here, it makes me proud. You've carried on what we built. You're doing it right." There was another round of applause, gentle but heartfelt. James stepped back from the microphone, nodding slightly, and returned to stand beside the captain. She smiled at him, eyes glistening. "You always did know how to say just enough," she said quietly. He chuckled. "That's the trick, Captain. Talk too much and they stop listening." The ceremony went on, but something had shifted. The crowd's attention wasn't just on the speeches or the music anymore. It was on the feeling in the air, unity, gratitude, connection. As the national anthem played again, James stood tall, hand over his heart. This time he wasn't standing alone at the edge of the crowd. He was right in the center, surrounded by the people who understood him best. The soldiers beside him sang softly, their voices blending with the sound of the band. When the song ended, the announcer invited the audience to take a moment of silence to honor those who had served and those who never came home. James closed his eyes. The breeze brushed against his face, and for a moment, he could almost hear the voices of his old comrades, laughing, talking, calling out commands in the middle of dusty fields. He whispered under his breath, "We did all right, boys. We did all right." After the silence, the captain turned to him. "Sir, would you walk with us when we leave the stage? The men and women want you at the front." James hesitated. "You sure about that?" "I'm a little out of step these days," she smiled. Then we'll slow down to match you." As they began to march off the stage, the crowd rose to their feet again. Flags waved, people clapped, and even a few tears were wiped away. The young security guard stood near the front, his hat held against his chest, watching them pass. James gave him a small nod, and the guard nodded back with respect. Walking beside his old unit, James felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. The rhythm of the boots on the pavement echoed memories of another time, another place, but this time the sound didn't remind him of war. It reminded him of family. When they reached the end of the field, the captain stopped and turned to him. "We're having a small gathering at the community hall after this. Food, stories, a few laughs. You'll come, won't you?" James looked at her, his eyes warm. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." The group shared a laugh, and one of the younger soldiers, barely in his 20s, stepped forward shyly. "Sir, my grandfather served under you. He used to talk about you all the time. Said you looked after your men like they were your own." James was taken aback. "Your grandfather?" "Yes, sir. He passed a few years ago, but he always said you were the reason he made it home." For a moment, James couldn't speak. He just placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and nodded. "Your grandfather was a good man. He made us all better." They stood there for a moment, the past and present meeting in quiet understanding. As the sun began to lower, painting the sky with orange light, James realized something he hadn't before. The ceremony wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about passing it on. The lessons, the courage, the love of country and each other. And in that moment, he knew he had come full circle. He had arrived that morning feeling unseen, forgotten. But now, as he stood surrounded by the next generation, he understood that legacy doesn't fade. It lives in the people who carry it forward. He smiled softly and looked at the captain. "You know, I almost left today." The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden lines across the grass. The ceremony had ended, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. People stayed around, talking, shaking hands, taking pictures, and sharing stories. The band had packed up their instruments, yet the spirit of the day still lingered in the air. James stood near the stage, surrounded by the same soldiers who had welcomed him back. Their laughter filled the space between the fading echoes of the event. Someone handed him a cup of coffee, and for the first time in a long while he felt truly at peace. He looked around, quietly taking it all in. The crowd had thinned, but a few families still lingered. Children ran around waving small flags, their laughter carrying through the air. The scene made him smile. This, the sound of life, of freedom, was what every veteran had hoped to protect. The captain walked over, carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate. She offered one to him with a small grin. "I figured you might like something sweet after all that attention." He chuckled and took the cup. "You remembered," he said. "I used to keep a pack of cocoa in my rucksack during winter patrols. The guys never let me forget it." "I was one of them," she said, smiling. "That little tradition stuck with the unit. We still bring it out on long assignments. It's kind of a lucky charm now." James laughed softly. "Guess I left more behind than I thought." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sky shift to soft orange and pink. The sound of the flag rustling in the wind was steady and calm. "You know," the captain said after a moment, "we almost didn't make it here today. The bus had a delay. We got here just in time for the march." James looked at her with a gentle smile. "Funny how things work out, isn't it? If you'd been any later, I would have been halfway home by now." She nodded, her expression softening. Sometimes life lines things up for a reason. He thought about that. Maybe it really had been fate. Maybe he was meant to be here, to be reminded that he wasn't forgotten, that his years of service still mattered. The younger soldiers began packing their things nearby. A few came up to shake his hand and thank him for his service. He spoke to each of them with genuine care, asking where they were stationed, what they hoped to do next, offering small bits of advice that came naturally to him. One young man said quietly, "Sir, I hope I'm half the soldier you were." James smiled kindly. "Son, just be the kind of man your team can count on. That's all that ever matters." It wasn't about being a hero or earning medals. It was about being there, for your people, for your country, for what's right. As the group began to head toward the community hall for the gathering, James took one last look at the emptying field. The chairs were being folded up, the banners taken down, and the last few flags waved gently in the cool evening air. He thought about how the day had started, the misunderstanding, the embarrassment, the feeling of not belonging. And now, looking around, that memory felt far away. The day had turned into something beautiful, something he hadn't expected but desperately needed. The captain called out, "You coming with us?" He turned back, smiling. "I'll be right there." As he walked across the field, he noticed the young security guard standing near the gate, still looking a little uneasy. James stopped beside him. "Hey," he said kindly, "you did your job today. Don't feel bad about it." The guard looked surprised. "I'm really sorry, sir. I didn't mean to disrespect you." James patted him on the shoulder. "You didn't. You followed the rules you were given. That's what we're all taught to do. Just remember, sometimes people have stories that don't show on paper." The guard nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you, sir," James smiled. "Take care of yourself, son." Then he continued walking, feeling lighter with every step. At the community hall, the atmosphere was warm and lively. Tables were set with simple food, sandwiches, soup, and coffee. Laughter filled the room as veterans swapped old stories, some exaggerated, some half-true, all full of heart. James found himself at the center of a small group, listening more than talking, smiling as the memories flowed. It felt good, really good, to be part of it again. Later in the evening, the captain stood up and tapped a spoon against her glass. The room quieted. "There's one last thing I'd like to say before we end this day," she began. "Today reminded us of something important, that honor doesn't fade with time. It lives in every person who continues to remember and respect those who came before them. And for that, we thank Sergeant Walker for showing us what true service looks like." The room filled with applause once again. Some people stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. James tried to wave it off humbly, but the emotion in the room was overwhelming. He stood and simply said, "Thank you. But this isn't about me. It's about all of us, every man and woman who gave something of themselves. We all share the same flag, the same promise." It was quiet after that, and a good, respectful silence. Then someone began to hum a tune softly, and soon the room joined in. It was an old song soldiers used to sing, slow, steady, full of pride. James listened, smiling, his eyes glistening just a little. As the night went on, the group started to thin. Some left early, others stayed to clean up. James walked outside to the porch where the night air was cool and fresh. The stars above seemed brighter than usual. The captain joined him again, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "It's been a long day," she said. "Best one I've had in years," he replied. They stood side by side watching the stars. The town was quiet now, and the sound of the wind was soft, almost like a whisper. After a long pause, James said, "You know, this morning, I thought I didn't belong here anymore. I thought the world had moved on." The captain looked at him gently. "And what do you think now?" He smiled faintly. "I think maybe I just needed to be reminded that you never stop being part of something you gave your heart to." She nodded. "Once a soldier, always a soldier," he chuckled. "Guess so." As they stood there, James felt an ease he hadn't felt in years. The loneliness that had sat quietly in his chest for so long seemed to fade into the night. He realized that belonging wasn't about ceremonies or medals. It was about connection, about being remembered and remembering others in return. When the last of the soldiers said their goodbyes and headed out, the captain shook his hand one more time. "See you next year, Sergeant." He smiled warmly. "You can count on it." Then she left, and James walked slowly toward his old pickup truck. The field where the ceremony had taken place was empty now, quiet under the stars. He paused, looking back one last time. He felt grateful for the day, for the people, for the chance to feel alive again. As he started the engine and drove off, he said softly to himself, "Guess I didn't have to leave after all." The headlights faded down the road, leaving behind the gentle sound of the flag still waving in the night breeze. A quiet reminder that some things, once earned, never fade away.